Welcome to the JCPS series on elementary school multi-tiered systems of support for behavior. The focus of this module is on how student intervention teams prepare for and implement progress monitoring for behavior. Progress monitoring is the term we use to describe the processes of assessing student progress in meeting their specific goals and evaluating the effectiveness of intervention. While progress monitoring is a legal requirement for students on an individualized education program, or IEP, it is also considered best practice for any student receiving interventions at tiers 2 or 3. Logically, if we are concerned enough to identify a student as at risk and develop an intervention, whether it be small group instruction or a more individualized behavior plan, we should be equally as concerned with the progress. Progress monitoring is continuous, something we measure very regularly. In fact, progress monitoring for behavior may involve collecting data every day. What is collected, how it is collected, and how often it is collected is dependent upon the student, the nature of his or her challenges, and the scope of the intervention. For example, the student has had several major outbursts this year, and the student intervention team worked with the counselor to have him attend small group instruction focused on emotional regulation and anger control. Whether the student is improving with regard to their emotional regulation is not something we can measure every day. However, we can provide their teachers with definitions of positive and negative behavior and check in weekly for reports. In contrast, another student has been engaging in disruptive behaviors in the classroom. Several times a day, the student makes rude comments or yells out loudly. In response, the student intervention team has developed a contract with them, under which they need to reduce the number of such disruptions by half in order to earn privileges. Because the student's behavior is so frequent, to simply check in with teachers once a week is unlikely to provide sufficient information. Instead, teachers will need to actually count how many disruptions the student has on a daily basis. Progress monitoring with academics might be accomplished by administering what we call permanent product assessment. These include tests, assignments, and other work that can be kept as evidence. Although it might be possible to have a permanent product such as broken pencils or torn papers, progress monitoring with behavior generally requires actual observations of behavior. We have to see it and record it in some manner. Behavior assessment requires attention to dimensions such as frequency or how often, duration or how long it lasts, and latency or how long it takes for something to start after a prompt. These are all fairly common, and we can measure with a simple tally or a timer. Importantly, while oversight of progress monitoring is the job of the student intervention team, the actual collection of data is done by teachers and others with whom the students interact on a daily basis. Even with these simple methods, it is often challenging for teachers to find the time or remember to collect data. The student intervention team can make this easier by helping teachers to consider tricks for data collection.
We know that collecting data for teachers can be very cumbersome, especially in a classroom full of tons of other kids. So we try to help find the easiest way for them to collect data so that we could get an accurate picture of what might be going on in the classroom.
For example, one easy way to collect tally data is to fill a pocket with paper clips. Every time the student engages in target behavior, one paperclip is moved to another pocket. Teachers can do this while standing in front of a class, and students will never notice the counting strategy. Another low-tech but very effective tally strategy is to put a piece of masking tape on an inner forearm. When the target behavior is observed, the teacher can subtly make a tally on the tape. If students ask what the tape is for, teachers can always just say they are keeping track of something and leave it at that. When measuring duration or latency, a phone, tablet, or watch are easy ways to record. Most of these devices have a timer application that can be easily tapped to start and stop. One must simply start the timer when the behavior begins and stop it when behavior ends. That time can then be recorded on a paper or directly on the device. When done, episodes can be added together for a total duration or average to get an index of the average duration. Watch the team talk this through with a teacher who is preparing to collect data on an intervention for a student's latency.
Thanks again for joining us, Ms. Jonas. As you know, we've been talking a little bit more about Janine and how she doesn't really want to sit down when you tell her to, especially after free time.
Well, we have developed an intervention that I think will help decrease the time it takes her to sit down after I ask her to take her seat. The problem is I just don't really know how quick is enough.
A good strategy would to be time the students that are doing it correctly, and that would be a good goal for her.
Well, I know it if I see it, but I don't know what that time is.
Exactly, and I think that's where we can start talking about measuring the latency from the prompt and when they actually do it. And then the class average would be the goal for Janine.
I can't see that I have time to actually time kids all day long.
I know, it sounds like it could be overwhelming. Don't think about timing kids all day. Just focus on Janine and maybe just time her how long it takes her to return to her seat after free time.
Right. And the good thing is, all you have to do is time the entire class once. That's it. You get your time, you get your goal, and now you're just timing Janine.
Okay, but I'm still not sure how I can pull that off.
We can help with that. Like, do you carry a tablet with you?
I don't carry a tablet when I'm teaching and moving around in class, but I do carry my phone with me.
Okay, so you could get your phone ready as soon as you're about to give the prompt and then start the timer when you do give that prompt, and then that way you can have it ready.
Okay, so then when she takes a seat, I would hit stop.
That's it. And then you can just write that time in a log, and we'll have progress monitoring over time to see whether or not she's improving and to see whether or not our interventions are effective.
Yeah.
Okay, I can give that a shot.
Another very common measure is concerned with how often a behavior occurs under specific circumstances. We'll call this opportunity-driven data. For example, we're interested in knowing how often the student is able to raise their hand when a group question is asked. On the first day, the teacher asked 6 questions and the student raised their hand 3 times. The next day, the teacher asked 3 questions and the student raised their hand twice. If we just look at the frequency, the student's hand raising went from 3 to 2, and it looks like it's going down. But the teacher provided different numbers of opportunities for hand raising on these 2 days. On day 1, they raised their hand 3 of 6, or 50% of opportunities, and on day 2, they raised their hand 2 of 3, or 67% of opportunities. Many of the behaviors of interest for students are opportunity-driven, like the student hand raising, and thus must be measured as a percent of opportunities in which they occurred. Behaviors such as appropriate responses to criticism, handling conflict peacefully, and saying please when asked a question are all opportunity-driven behaviors. They would require criticism, conflict, or a question needing to be asked before data on behavior could be collected. A simple way to collect opportunity-driven data is to count both the opportunity and then the presence or absence of a behavior. As a simple tally, this can be done with 2 symbols, one that designates an opportunity and another indicating that the behavior was appropriate. This data says that the teacher asked 7 group questions on January 9th and that the student raised their hand 5 times. We could then say that the student raised their hand during 5 divided by 7, or 71% of opportunities, so they continue to improve. Let's watch how the team introduces this concept to a teacher who will be collecting this type of data.
All right, so next up we have Brenda Smith on the agenda, and her teacher, Ms. Stern, is here, so thanks for being here. Welcome.
Thanks. I really hope the plan we talk about today helps because Brenda's behavior is really taxing.
Yeah, and just a review, Ms. Stern has come to us because Brenda has had a hard time handling peer conflict in the classroom.
Yeah, it's not like it happens all day, but it happens at least a couple times every day.
Is it obvious? Do you see the conflict before the behavior, or do you just see the behavior that she does?
Usually, yes. I'm always scanning, so I see the conflict, and I see her curse and blow up at students.
Gotcha.
So we would just need to know how she responds when there is a conflict.
Yeah, I probably could just tally up however many times she curses every day.
Sure, but if there's no conflict, then there's nothing to see. So you want to be sure you're focused on when there is a conflict, seeing how she handles that.
Okay, how would I do that?
It can still be as simple as a tally. You would just need to tally when there is a conflict and then her response. Stephanie, you used a strategy in your classroom. Can you explain?
Yeah, you can just use a mark of some kind, like say a 0, and then if she handles the behavior the way that you've taught her to, you can put a slash through the 0. If she doesn't handle it appropriately, then you would just let the 0 stand alone.
Okay, that seems fairly simple, but why do I have to do all that?
It's because we have to account for all the opportunities. If she has no cursing, we would say 0, but what if there were no conflicts? So we need to be able to count how often she curses when there has been a conflict.
So like, for example, I'll take a piece of tape and I'll put it on my forearm in the classroom. And if I see her having a conflict, then I will mark a 0. Well, based off of how she responds on that conflict, I will, and help me out, Stephanie, correct me if I'm wrong, I'll put a slash through it to let me know she handled the conflict appropriately. But if I see her in conflict and she does not handle it appropriately, then I'll keep the 0.
Okay, I could see how that would standardize the measure and, make it easier to track her progress.
Exactly.
So far, everything we've described is a direct measure. That is, when a behavior is observed, we immediately record it with a tally or a start-stop of the watch. This type of data tends to be a very accurate representation of student behavior, but it also can be very time-consuming, requiring the observer to constantly monitor behavior. Another strategy for collecting behavioral progress monitoring data is to note whether a behavior occurred or did not occur during a period of time. In this method, called time sampling, it's the timer rather than the behavior that tells us to record. Using these time-based methods, we simply define an interval, let's say a 40-minute period. Then we record whether behavior occurred during that interval. Of course, the shorter the interval, the more accurate the data. Intervals can be longer with low-rate behaviors, those behaviors that don't occur that often, and we can use something called partial interval recording. With this method, the teacher records a plus if the behavior happened at any time during that interval, even if only once and briefly. Let's watch the student intervention team thinking this through with the teacher.
I appreciate you all helping me try to figure out how to track Eddie's wandering around, but to be honest, I can't imagine having to track his in-seat and out-of-seat behavior.
Yeah, that would be super overwhelming, even if he's not out of his seat that often.
He's not out of his seat that often, but when he is, it can last a long time.
And we can show you a measurement strategy so that you're not having to time him all the time. You would just need a countdown timer or a timer where it would signal you at regular intervals.
So I noticed that you're wearing a smartwatch. So this will do all that for you. So go into your app, your timer app, and you just set an interval for about 5 minutes. So you start it and let it count down. At the end of that interval, your watch will vibrate, and that's letting you know it's time to record.
And then you can just go about your teaching, and anytime Eddie gets out of his seat, you would put a plus in the box for that interval once your watch has signaled that time up.
And this will continue every 5 minutes during your in-seat time. So if he wasn't out of seat during any time, you'll record a 0 in the box.
Okay, but I'm not really sure what all this is telling me.
It's just an estimation of the time he's out of his seat. So at the end of the day, you'll have a percentage of the intervals that you observed that he spent out of his seat.
And then you can use that to keep track of if he's making improvements based on the interventions that we put in place or not.
Where do I write this?
You can just put it on a sticky note like this each day, but we will show you how to do that.
Obviously, this method will tend to overestimate behavior, but this isn't a problem because the behavior happens infrequently. The main thing is that it produces consistent data that allows us to track whether the student's behavior is changing. If the behavior of concern is high rate, it happens frequently, then we can use something called momentary interval recording. With this method, the teacher records a plus if the behavior is happening right at the end of the interval. Even if it was happening throughout the interval, if it is not happening when the interval ends, the teacher records a 0. Let's watch the student intervention team thinking through momentary interval recording with the teacher.
As long as you're here, Mr. Hansen, let's go ahead and talk about Gail Winters too. We're going to need to develop a measure for her.
Okay, she's really a challenge because I can tell you right now that if we use the same measure for her as we developed for Eddie, it's just going to show intervals 100% of the time because she's constantly talking out loud.
And we're going to be implementing a new intervention for her too, using differential reinforcement of low rates of behavior. So it's just a good time to talk about that measure.
Okay, there's no way I could count how often she's talking or time her talking because it's all the time.
We can still use a time-based system like we did with Eddie, but we'll change the way we do it to make it more simple, given her high rate of behavior.
It'll be just like we did with Eddie, except for one key difference. When she's talking aloud, you'll put a plus in the box when your watch signals you.
Okay, but because I'm also doing this with Eddie, I don't know about doing this every 5 minutes.
It's okay. We can set it to every 15 minutes because you'll be doing it all day.
Won't this tend to underestimate then how often she's talking out loud?
Probably, but it's okay because it'll be consistent.
And if she's talking that often, it'll give us a good index for tracking her progress.
Okay, so if I look at her right when my timer vibrates, I put a plus if she's talking out loud and a 0 if she's not?
So, yep, it doesn't matter what she's doing during the interval. You only need to observe her and make a mark at the end of each interval.
We've looked at several different strategies for collecting progress monitoring data for behavior. Remember, selecting the right one is a two-step process. First, we need to determine the question we have about the behavior. Then we select the instrument, depending on how much time the observer has and how precise the measure needs to be. This decision tree is helpful in determining the best choice for measuring behavior. The first question gets at whether the behavior is opportunity-driven because there is only one option for this type of behavior. Student intervention teams can simply think through this decision tree, using their questions about behavior to find the most logical measurement strategy. Watch as the team uses the decision tree to identify logical strategies.
We have 2 new intervention plans, so we kind of need to talk about their progress monitoring.
Yeah, the first is April. Remember, she's having difficulty with making noises. She whistles and hoots.
This isn't opportunity driven, so what is it that we want to know?
Well, it looks like she's being taught some form of self-management. They want to know how many times the noises are happening, so I guess it seems easy enough to count whistles unless they're happening really fast.
And from what our records show, it doesn't really happen at high rates.
Do you think the teacher would have time to count?
Looks like it happens several times a day.
So it looks like tallies make sense. We could get her a clicker, and that way it could help her keep track. Who else needs a measurement strategy for progress monitoring?
The last one is Quinn. He's a kindergarten student. He's receiving social skills instruction to decrease his physically aggressive behavior during centers. He seems to do that without warning when he gets frustrated.
Okay, so non-opportunity driven, but how often does this happen?
According to the records, it's happening so often that it's going to be hard to count.
Well, it's high rate and we can't count them all. Looks like momentary interval recording would be what's best here.
In summary, progress monitoring is simply the process we use to answer questions about whether our interventions are effective in terms of helping a given student meet his or her goals. To answer these questions requires frequent data over time so that trends can be identified and changes made as necessary. But as with any of the things we discuss under MTSS, the trick is to find the simplest method of gathering key pieces of information. This brings us to the end of the elementary version, multi-tiered systems of support for behavior. The focus has been on how MTSS teams consider behavior at the school level, implement universal screening for at-risk behavior, facilitate additional collection of behavior data for interventions, consider the essential components of effective intervention, and engage in progress monitoring. Throughout, the purpose has been to illustrate how teams assist the school in creating positive learning environments and support systems for all. As we mentioned in Module 1, the MTSS process is cyclical, with screening leading to reteaching and adaptation of supports, which in turn leads to more screening. This process is continuous, it is never complete. But as Tier 1 systems are better aligned to student need, fewer students will be identified as at risk.